Hey everyone, Alexander here for another installment of Fridays at the Symphony. And as we've been making our tour through the musical glories of the letter D, it's time to come to the symphonies of one of my very, very favorite composers. And I'm guessing a composer who's a favorite of many of you. That would be the great, great Czech composer of the later 19th century, Antonin Dvorak. Now, we all know and love Dvorak because we all know and love the Cello Concerto or the New World Symphony, the last of his 9 symphonies, and by far the most frequently played. But did you know that, or did you realize that there are 8 equally glorious symphonies that come before the Symphony Number 9, the New World? And each of them is a glory unto itself. Dvorak, like Schubert, like Mahler, and most especially like Beethoven, left the world 9 completed symphonies. However, compared to Beethoven, they have a much more difficult passage into the repertoire. Dvorak was born in 1841 in a small village in what is now the Czech Republic, but of course was then in the province, the kingdom, I should say, the kingdom of Bohemia in the great, sprawling, multicultural Habsburg Empire, whose grand capital, of course, was Vienna. Dvorak was the son of a butcher who was also an innkeeper in, again, a little village in Bohemia. He learned to play various musical instruments and was expected to go into the family business, but Dvorak was bound and determined to be a musician. And in the life story of Dvorak, we find really one of the great survivors, musically speaking, of the 19th century, and one of the great figures of perseverance in the music of the Romantic era. Dvorak was determined to overcome his humble circumstances and become one of the world's great composers. And he did. He did it, of course, through a combination of not some romantic, concept of this pure genius, but genius in that he had an amazing talent and he also had an incredible propensity for dedication and for hard work. In this little village in which he grew up in Bohemia, he learned how to play several instruments, the violin, the piano, the organ, and the viola. And it was the viola that would eventually get him to the capital, musically and otherwise, of Bohemia, and now the Czech Republic, of course, one of the great ancient cities of Europe, golden Prague. And he got a job playing the viola in what was then called the Provisional Theater in Prague. Provisional because it was the opera house in which operas were performed in the native language of the people, in Czech, whereas the National Theater, i.e. national as in the Habsburg Empire, the operas would mainly be in German. Dvorak got to play his viola in both orchestras, both pit orchestras, the Provisional Theater, where all these, hot off the press works of emerging nationalist Czech composers, like his musical older brother, 17 years his senior, Bedřich Smetana. He's the composer who left us that great cycle of tone poems called Má vlast, My Homeland. Well, Smetana was the conductor of the Provisional Theater, so Dvorak was there in the opera house, in the pit, the orchestra pit, playing all of the latest new works by Czech composers. And then on his off nights, he'd play in the National Theater, again, the German opera house in Prague, where all of the great standard repertoire would be performed, whether it be German, the great German operas, Beethoven, Carl Maria von Weber. Weber, the man who wrote Der Freischütz and Oberon, in the mid-19th century, a toweringly important composer, most especially for the young, penniless, hardworking viola player, Antonin Dvorak. It was the spectral figure of Richard Wagner, who in 1863 came to Prague to conduct the theater orchestra in a program of his own works, most specifically Tristan and Isolde, and Die Meistersinger von Nuremberg, and Tannhäuser, and Die Walküre, the Valkyries from the Ring cycle. This left an impression on the young Dvorak which was indelible and profound. And what Dvorak, more than, say, the more Slavophile type artists and composers like Smetana, what Dvorak wanted to do was not only become one of the great composers of his time, which he certainly did, he also wanted to find a synthesis between the Germanic and the Slavic musical languages. In other words, be part of this larger multicultural Habsburg universe, which was really one of the great flowerings of musical culture in all of history, but at the same time remain a committed Czech patriot. I think this is why Dvorak, midway into his career, became extremely popular in the German-speaking lands of Europe, but we'll get to that later. Anyway, Dvorak is this, starving artist, viola player, playing whatever gig he can get in both the national and provisional theater orchestras in Prague. He's sharing an apartment with several other guys, and somehow he finds the time and space to prodigiously compose. And when we think of the 9 symphonies of Dvorak, and there are definitely 9, and you're probably asking yourself, why don't you hear the other 8? Well, you probably hear, if you love classical music, and even if you have a passing knowledge of or experience of classical music, you know that the 9th symphony, the New World Symphony, is, of course, has been for over a century, been extremely popular. Indeed, I would say almost too popular. The previous 2 symphonies, the number 7 and the number 8, are also played quite a lot these days. Still, it's the earlier 6 symphonies that have always been, really, and remain to this day, sadly, a mystery. Dvorak, it's 1863. Let's get back to our story. He's just played in the pit orchestra under Richard Wagner, the musical giant of the time. And he runs to his little apartment, which he's sharing with all these other musicians, and he just writes out 2 symphonies, his first 2 symphonies, these gargantuan works, bursting with beautiful ideas, but bursting with beautiful things as in like an overgrown garden. If you really are a diehard Dvorak fan like I am, you can fall in love with the first 2 symphonies, just for the sheer beauty of their ideas and for the sincerity of their expression. You really do feel as if you are getting to know Dvorak the man, who was a man not unlike César Franck, the great Belgian composer of that era, a man without guile, without any kind of surface sophistication. Well, he writes these first 2 symphonies, and again, each of them is such a cornucopia of beautiful ideas, but in terms of compositions, they're rather out of control. They both verge on an hour in duration. And again, it's like this Dvorak is this brilliant young artist, and he just has all these ideas, and he just can't help himself. He's not yet capable of organizing his ideas in an effective manner. And the thing about classical music is there can be works that can be extremely long, like a symphony by Anton Bruckner, which we were discussing earlier. Bruckner symphonies are all at least an hour long, but at the same time, Bruckner has this incredible economy of means. He sets out to express a certain set of things, limited set of things, and he does it with incredible, depth and profundity. Dvorak is not yet at that stage. He's a great young artist full of ideas, but again, doesn't yet have the artistic self-discipline with which to organize them. He spends the rest of the 1860s just doggedly plugging away, somehow surviving. He begins to get a circle of admirers, particularly in the world of chamber music. His other towering achievement as a composer, in which he is absolutely the equal of his friend and slightly older colleague, Johannes Brahms. When we think of great 19th century composers, we always pair them, Beethoven and Schubert, Schumann and Mendelssohn, and then we always pair Dvorak and Brahms. But the other way, along with symphonies, in which Dvorak was absolutely the equal of Johannes Brahms, was his string quartets, his chamber music with piano and with strings alone. And then in the early 1870s, he does another incredibly important thing in his life. He gets married. Now, he doesn't just get married, but he marries the sister of the girl with whom he was originally in love. This is a great Central European tradition. Haydn and most famously Mozart fell in love with a beautiful young woman. They were rebuffed, and so they married her sister. And this is what Dvorak did. And he had, Josefina had refused him, so he, a few years later, proposed to and married Anna. And they had a beautiful, beautiful and productive life, long life together into the very earliest years of the 20th century, in fact. Well, it's this new flowering of self-confidence that then Dvorak, not unlike Beethoven used to do, writing symphonies in pairs. Remember when we were talking about Beethoven, it was just amazing. He'd write like the Sixth Symphony and the Fifth Symphony and the Sixth Symphony at almost the same time, and then he'd write the Sixth and the Seventh, and he kept like interlocking symphonies. Well, Dvorak does this too. He writes the Third and the Fourth Symphonies, both in the early 1870s, around 1872. Here, as compared to the symphonies numbers 1 and 2, we have, my friends, a totally different composer. We have the very beginning of a great genius composer entering his prime. So, to be fair to Dvorak, because the First Symphony, there's an amazing story about the First Symphony. He wrote it for a competition in some far-off capital. I think it was Vienna, but I'm not sure. It might have been some Budapest or somewhere. He wrote the symphony. He wrote out one manuscript copy, and this is the days which they didn't have photocopiers. You couldn't take a picture, you couldn't scan it and email it to someone. He had one copy of the manuscript, and he sent it off to, I don't know, Leipzig or someplace. And it didn't win in the competition, and they didn't bother to send it back because he would have had to pay the postage, and he was such a poor, struggling musician, he couldn't afford the postage. So for the rest of his life, he thought his First Symphony was lost forever. And it was discovered like in an antiquarian bookshop in Prague in the 1920s or 30s. Anyway, and his Second Symphony, again, it was like a forlorn child. He tried to revise it, but it never really worked. I would say to you that the true First Symphony of Antonin Dvorak is the symphony you're going to hear now. Tragically, to this day, it is almost totally unknown, and it's not unfortunate. It is a musical crime that the Symphony Number 3 of Antonin Dvorak is almost never performed, because again, here we have Dvorak entering into his majority, as they would say in the legal profession. Here is Dvorak, this great, confident, assured young composer. You still have that beauteous cornucopia of ideas. Dvorak, in case you don't know it already, I'll let you know now, Dvorak is one of the supreme melodists in the history of music. He is only equaled by, I would say, Tchaikovsky in this respect. Just this astonishingly gifted composer of melodies. So you get these 3 beautiful melodies in the first movement, but they are presented with such an economy of means. And this, in the genius of this, from the very first phrase of the very first melody, you sense the genius. And you know why you sense it? Because he's taken he has reined in his youthful passions, his love of the music of Richard Wagner and Franz Liszt, the other great firebrand romantic of the mid-19th century, and Beethoven and Schubert. But then he has aligned those Romantic era influences with the classicism of the composers he's finally gotten around to studying from the late 18th century. Mozart, and even more than Mozart, Haydn. Haydn. Remember Haydn? I've talked about Haydn being the influence on Beethoven with his monothematic symphonic movements where everything is based on one idea. Well, here you get this Haydn-esque economy of means. It is truly a wonder to behold the economical organization of his ideas that is this utterly perfect first movement in sonata allegro form. Remember, 3 ideas presented, developed, and recapitulated into a magnificent climax of a coda. There are only 3 movements to this symphony, which was a radical thing because in the mid-19th century, when you wrote a symphony, it had to have 4 movements. But Dvorak here, not unlike our beloved Belgian César Franck, dispenses, formally speaking, with a scherzo movement. And you have this gigantic slow movement in the middle, the central movement of the symphony's 3 movements. One critic of about the mid-20th century remarked that the 3 movements of Dvorak's Third Symphony could be almost seen in the very best sense as 3 symphonic poems, 3 kind of musical tone pictures. And if the first movement would be like a symphonic poem of a composer amid nature, not unlike the Beethoven of the Pastoral Symphony, this slow movement would be a symphonic poem that's really a grand, heroic funeral march, inspired by the funeral march from, guess what? Again, remember I've been talking about composers signaling, communicating to their audiences through signals. Here again, the Third Symphony of Beethoven. And you know what that means, the slow movement, the funeral march, because Dvorak signals to his audience by this connection by way of the key. This symphony is in E flat, the most heroic of keys, and the key of Beethoven's Third Symphony. So we get this central slow movement, this grand funeral march of a tone poem that is like one part Beethoven, one part Richard Wagner, the tragic Wagner of the Ring Cycle, and just this almost nihilistically tragic kind of sense that you get in Wagner's music, but the basic inspiration being Beethoven's funeral march. Dvorak here works through the grandest of ternary forms, 3-part forms, kind of a big A section, a B section, then a return to the A section. The B section works up to this, it's impossible to describe this grand dramatic climax where you sense that even if you are a Dvorak doubter, even if you don't love his music the way some of the rest of us do, you cannot fail to be impressed by the grandeur of this climax of the central slow movement funeral march. The third movement of the, again, only 3 movements, is the shortest and most concise. It is the most jubilant little rondo you have ever heard. You remember what a rondo is. It's a recurring idea form. So it's A, B, A, C, A. And the A idea, the basic idea, keeps coming back. This is 9.5 minutes of just unending invention and ecstatic joy. This little phrase, this da 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 da. Again, the economy of means. Dvorak has now learned how to rein in his compositional impulses, and inspired by the shining torch, the burning torch of an example of the great Franz Joseph Haydn, learns to make an entire symphonic movement out of one little idea. And it's this jaunty little dance in double time that you'll just fall in love with. But it keeps getting developed and modulated in these unendingly amazing ways. And it ends, it's like you're dancing around, I don't know, on a village green and somewhere in the olden days, and you just fall, you collapse in ecstasy. That is the spirit, in the most pure-hearted sense, the ecstasy of this Symphony Number 3 of Dvorak. I conclude by saying that Dvorak's hard work and dedication would almost immediately pay off. after the composition of his third and fourth symphonies. The third symphony was performed just months after he wrote it in 1873 in Prague. Beatrix Smetana, his older mentor and friend, conducted. Dvorak then sent the scores of the third and fourth symphonies to another competition in Vienna. It was a competition for an imperial state stipend, which was to be awarded by a music committee organized by the Habsburg government in Vienna. And sitting on that committee was a slightly older, by then already very well known and admired composer, a certain composer named Johannes Brahms. And Brahms was immediately impressed by these two powerful, concise symphonies by this young, unknown Bohemian composer. And he recommended, he not forced, but he persuaded his colleagues on this imperial committee to award this young Antonin Dvorak the stipend. It was literally the great lucky break of Dvorak's career, and from then on, everything was coming up roses, and Dvorak would be the equal of composers like not only Brahms, but I think of Verdi and Elgar and Tchaikovsky as being one of the greatest, most admired, and most successful composers in Europe. And of course, near the end of his career, he would make the storied visit to America, but we'll get to that later. Just now, enjoy yourselves. This, what I'm sure for you will be a gorgeous discovery, the Symphony No. 3 in E-flat major by Antonin Dvorak.